So let's talk about relapse. Let's talk about relapse to addiction and pornography addiction specifically, because that's what a lot of people on YouTube are here for, realistically. It's nofap. But this, of course, applies to things like a nicotine addiction, a social media addiction, whatever. So we're going to talk about what happens when someone's been abstaining from a certain addiction and then they relapse to it. So a relapse is when they use that thing again. So if pornography, maybe you've gone a couple of days without watching porn, and then you watch porn again, you masturbate, you orgasm, blah, blah, blah. So what happens? And we're going to specifically look through the vein of pornography here. So of course, the second that you relapse, there is a huge dopamine release. So there's an area in the brain called the nucleus accumbens, and it is stimulated, releasing a lot of dopamine, a large spike of dopamine. The mesolimbic pathway is also activated. So that's the kind of pathway, it's called the reward pathway, which starts at your ventral tegmental area, which is a part of the base of your brain, and moves up through the brain to the prefrontal cortex, specifically the left dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex, which is about here. So this again releases more dopamine through this pathway, starting at the VTA. And what these two things do in combination, the release from the NAC and the VTA, is they strengthen this pathway, which is a bad thing if you're an addict. It's a bad thing if you're trying to recover from an addiction, because you'll go those couple of days where your brain starts to rewire itself, and then the second that you relapse, your brain will kind of strengthen the pathways that it's just been recovering from. So of course a relapse won't bring you down to complete zero. If you've been recovering for 7 days, your brain's started to rewire, and then you strengthen those pathways. It's not going to undo all the progress that you've made, but it will take you a step in the opposite direction from recovery. It will strengthen the addictive pathways again, making it harder to, say, resist an urge in the future. And that's what a lot of people find, is that when they relapse one day, it might actually be quite hard to restart the streak again. Maybe they've been going for 15, 20 days on a nofap streak, and then they relapse, and then for the next 2-3 days, they just can't stop watching porn. That's because that mesolimbic pathway has been activated again. That reward pathway that's so linked to porn has been reactivated, which is quite problematic. What else does it do though? You have a big endorphin release. So endorphins are called endogenous morphine. That's where the name comes from. And basically they're opioids. They're your body's natural painkiller that it releases in response to pain. So we're going to go more onto pain in the hours to come and the days to come after your relapse. But for now, just know that it creates euphoria and pleasure. Very similar in a way to kind of the feelings you might get from an exogenous or an external opioid like heroin use or morphine, for example. So it's going to calm you down. It's going to make you feel very good, basically. And finally is a prolactin release. So prolactin is a hormone in your body which basically, it tells you to stop having sex in the nicest way possible. So when you relapse once and you have that kind of incubation period, I don't know if that's the right word, but of about an hour, 2 hours, it's different for different people, when you can next have sex, when sexual stimulation doesn't really stimulate you anymore. That's because of a huge prolactin release. And prolactin is fine. It's a natural part of the body. It's why it's a good thing in many ways. It's a healthy response to orgasming. But chronic prolactin release, which is what you'll get from a porn addiction perhaps, if you're relapsing once every day, once every 2 days, once every 3 days, and you're constantly spiking your prolactin, has been linked to many negative side effects. Things like less libido, sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, depression and anxiety are all caused by chronic prolactin release. And if you struggle with something like a pornography addiction, then a lot of the downsides that you're getting from it are probably related to this hormone. It's related to the prolactin that's chronically being released, which in a small dose isn't bad, but every day is deeply problematic. It's why you're starting to feel lethargic, obviously along with the implications to your dopaminergic pathways, but prolactin specifically is making you feel lethargic. You basically feel like that kind of post-nut, I can't be doing anything, but forever. So prolactin, I'm not going to say it's bad, but it's kind of bad. It's got a weird kind of rep at the moment though, because it's also shown to increase testosterone. So prolactin stimulates LH, luteinizing hormone production, which in its turn kind of stimulates testosterone production. So people are like, oh, prolactin good because of testosterone. It's not really true though. We made a video on that and why that's not really the case. So go and check that out if you're interested in that idea. But anyway, to carry on, let's talk about the hours after your addiction. So in the following hours after addiction, what you're going to see is basically huge fluctuations in the levels of something in your brain called catecholamines. So catecholamines are a set of neuromodulators or neurotransmitters, specifically epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, that regulate various functions in your brain. So epinephrine and norepinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline and noradrenaline, are related to things like energy, stimulation, your ability to kind of move around. Dopamine is your motivation neuromodulator. It's the thing that gets you to do things, to seek pleasure, to go and do nice and fun stuff. But basically what happens when you experience that huge spike in dopamine is your body tries to maintain something called homeostasis, which, if you remember from GCSE biology, is the process of balance. It's your body's attempt to balance out your brain and your brain system. So what does it do? Well, it down-regulates dopamine receptors and increases the reuptake of dopamine. How can I explain that? Basically, dopamine gets kind of spat out by presynaptic neurons, and it lives in a place called the synaptic cleft until it's picked up by other neurons, postsynaptic neurons. It's sucked up by those. But if it isn't sucked up by those, and it kind of sits in that cleft for too long, it gets reuptaked by the presynaptic neuron. And when you stimulate a lot of dopamine release, it kind of stimulates that reuptake a lot more. So the postsynaptic neuron stops sucking in as much dopamine, and the presynaptic neuron starts sucking in a lot more. It starts taking a lot more of that dopamine back, which means that you have a lot less dopamine impacting your brain, which of course you can kind of imagine will have huge impacts on your motivation, but also on your general feelings of pleasure and happiness throughout your life. Very interestingly, kind of linked to this, is the discovery that pain receptors and pleasure receptors are co-located in the brain. It means they appear in the same places. And again, due to this homeostatic balance that the body is trying to keep, whenever too much pleasure is stimulated, the body needs to counteract that by releasing pain. So it releases substances like glutamate, like substance P, and it inhibits substances like serotonin to create genuine feelings of pain in the body. So if you're interoceptive enough and you can kind of tell about your body's processes, maybe next time if you relapse, you'll genuinely feel a kind of pain within you, a genuine pain similar to if you were to like hit yourself or stub your toe or something, like actual genuine pain, because the same things are being released in response to that. Now that is a problem, of course, in the short term, but say you only relapse once or twice in your entire life, when it's not really relapsing at that point. If you orgasm once or twice in your entire life, there isn't actually that much that pain receptor being released because the dopamine spike isn't too big. But if you're addicted, if you're an addict, then that dopamine spike is much bigger because you're less sensitive to it, and so the pain response is also much bigger, to the point where addicts often live in constant states of pain without even realizing it, because they're constantly stimulating that dopamine release. So in turn, they're constantly stimulating a pain response from the body. Very interesting, but that is basically what happens. It's hours after you'll start to feel a lot of pain. You'll start to feel anhedonia, so a lack of pleasure, a lack of motivation from the less dopamine in your body, but also a feeling of pain. And then finally, what a relapse will do in the hours following is it will deplete a lot of the precursors to dopamine. So dopamine is a synthesization pathway. And you don't need to know this in detail, but I'll go over the basic terms for you now. It goes from tyrosine to something called L-dopa to then finally dopamine. And it's converted by various other things like tyrosine hydroxylase and whatever. You don't need to know any of that. Those are all super technical words. But basically what you need to understand is that when you relapse and your body uses up a lot of dopamine, it depletes things like tyrosine inside of your body, which basically means that you can't produce as much dopamine in the future, which is again problematic for those feelings of anhedonia and for that lack of motivation. Finally, relapsing, very counterintuitively actually, because you think it gives you a lot of pleasure, but actually it induces the stress response of your body. It activates your body's stress response. Your amygdala gets activated. It sends signals down through the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis. Again, you don't need to know that. It sends little signals down. It stimulates cortisol production, adrenaline production. And these aren't necessarily bad in the short term, but again, it's that chronic release that's problematic. So if you go and watch our video on why you're always tired, we spoke about chronic sympathetic arousal, which is arousal of your sympathetic nervous system. What does this do? Well, it stimulates cortisol, which we've all heard is a bad thing. It increases your beats per minute of your heart, your blood pressure, your epinephrine. It just creates general feelings of discomfort and anxiety. Again, we spoke about this before, but it's like your amygdala is the point of your brain which processes internal things along with your insula and other parts of your brain. It processes internal environments and tries to put context onto them. And if it can't see an external stimulus, say that your blood pressure is starting to increase, your heart rate is starting to increase, cortisol is spiking because of this kind of hypothalamic response, your amygdala will get confused because it doesn't know why that's happening. So that will create a lot of anxiety and discomfort in you because you don't know exactly why you feel that weird. But a relapse will do that to you. It'll make you feel weird. So maybe if you feel anxiety or discomfort after a relapse, you literally feel jittery and a bit strange. There's something in your body that you don't know exactly what is up with it. This is why. So it's quite interesting to understand the mechanisms underlying this relapse. Then finally, in the days after, there's further neuroplasticity that occurs. So there's two things that happen here. It's called long-term potentiation and long-term depression of your neurons. And this basically strengthens neural connections, which again, as we spoke about, strengthens that addiction in the days following. What's very interesting about this is that it's in the days following, which is quite problematic for people that maybe think they're cutting down on pornography by relapsing only once every 2 or 3 days, but in reality that means they're in an almost constant state of neuroplasticity in the direction of the addiction. People think that they've cut down when they say, okay, well now I'm only relapsing once every 3 days, but in the nicest way possible, bro, that isn't really good enough. Like even that once every 3 days is still an addiction. You're still moving more in the direction of neuroplasticity towards addiction than you are in the way of healing. If you want to truly heal, you need to be going on long abstinence periods of weeks to months. If you want to, and this is going to sound proper bro sciencey, but if there was a way where you're going to introduce real, like a moderated pornography use, it would be to relapse maybe once every few weeks to a month. But that, of course, is not the ideal. But this system that you have going now, where you relapse once every 3 days because you've told yourself that you're recovering, it's not really true. And that's the problem with advice like people like Hamza give on this platform, where they say, but it's better because now you're only relapsing 33% of the time. But there's still almost as many negatives. Your brain is still almost completely moving towards strengthening that addiction. Every time you relapse, it strengthens that mesolimbic pathway again, that nucleus accumbens like we just spoke about. So problematic. Anyway, in that kind of scope though, you can sort of create a timeline out of addiction. And that's quite an interesting practice to do. It's quite a freeing practice really, because it can help you envision exactly where you might slip up on an addiction. And for starters, let's just get it out of the way, days 1 to 3 for some people, and for some people days 1 to 7 even, are going to be the hardest days for withdrawals. This is when you're going to feel real symptoms of agitation, anxiety, hypertension, mood fluctuations, irritability, all of these negative emotions associated with withdrawal. This is when you're going to feel those things. You're going to feel really shit, and also the urges and the cravings are going to be huge. Like we spoke about before, this is when your body has become kind of re-fired up to relapse again. It's called like the chaser effect. When you relapse once, the next few days are going to be very hard not to relapse again, but you have to power through it. You have to battle through those urges. And that's why things like the easy peasy method don't really work, because telling people to ignore those urges denies the very real aspect of them, which is that they are prevalent and they're very intense at those early stages. There's intense physiological functions taking place in your brain that are almost forcing you to relapse. You need to fight them. After that though, the kind of silver lining comes in. This is where you start to see a lot of the benefits of nofap, i.e. the return to normality. Between days like 18 to 14, a lot of the negative symptoms go away. You don't get any of the benefits per se, but the negative symptoms start to go away. You don't have the agitation, the irritability, the hypertension anymore. The urges are still there. They're slightly less, but you basically remove those negative symptoms. So that is already a very powerful step. And then on about day 14 to 15, and the timeline's different for different people, but roughly speaking around then, you're going to start seeing the benefits, the positives of these things. You're going to start feeling good again because your brain will have rewired in a way where it starts to appreciate the world again. Its dopamine pathways have restructured, and so it can take pleasure from external things, like food, like the sun, like just whatever, social interactions. Stuff starts happening again that's actually pleasurable. And the thing is this happens quite quickly. There's a big trend inside of nofap to look at 90 days as the kind of thing to aim for. But even after just 30, you're going to start to feel almost every single one of the benefits that nofap brings. So yeah, this video in a way is kind of scary because it deconstructs the idea of having to relapse, of being able to relapse once every 3 days. But in another vein, I want it to be empowering. I want you to know that if you can just hold out for 3, 4, 5 days, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. A very real one. And if you can fight hard and overcome those urges for even just a week, everything starts to get a lot easier. A lot easier. And then if you can overcome those urges for just 2, things start to get better. Real improvements start to come in to your life. And it only takes 2 weeks. All you have to do is fight those urges strongly for 2 weeks. Do whatever you can. Self-binding, distracting, following a purpose, whatever. Whatever you can do, just do it for 2 weeks, brother. And after that, you'll be fucking fine, bro. So yeah, thank you for watching the video. If you gained any value from it, drop a subscribe. And come see me in the next video. I'll see you tomorrow, brother. I am so proud of you. Manifest excellence. Goodbye.